By the early 2000s, investigators around the world were already fighting a growing battle against child exploitation on the internet. Broadband internet was becoming increasingly common, peer-to-peer file sharing networks were exploding in popularity, and for the first time law enforcement agencies were encountering vast collections of illegal images and videos being traded across international borders at an unprecedented scale. Among the thousands of files investigators examined, one particular series immediately stood out. The images showed the repeated sexual abuse of young boys in Southeast Asia. The victims appeared to come from countries including Cambodia, Vietnam, and Thailand. And while investigators were able to recover hundreds of photographs and videos, they all shared one frustrating detail. This is the story behind one of Asia's most notorious pedophiles. For years, nobody knew who he was. There was no name, no criminal record linking him to child abuse, no missing persons report, and no international warrant. Just a collection of disturbing images recovered from the darkest corners of the internet, all pointing towards the same unidentified man. Investigators believed he was a Western national, likely working or traveling throughout Southeast Asia during the early 2000s. From the background of photographs, witness accounts, and travel patterns, they concluded he had spent time in countries including Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, and South Korea. To people who crossed paths with him, he appeared completely ordinary. There was nothing immediately remarkable about his appearance, and nothing to suggest he would eventually become the subject of one of the largest international manhunts of the internet age. As law enforcement agencies investigated online child sexual abuse networks, they began recovering photographs and videos depicting the abuse of young boys in Southeast Asia. But there was one detail investigators couldn't ignore. Every time his face was visible, it had been deliberately obscured by a digitally applied spiral effect. It was a simple image filter, one that twisted his facial features just enough to prevent recognition. Whoever this man was, he clearly understood that his face was the single greatest threat to his anonymity. Over the next several years, more material linked to the same offender continued to surface. The victims were different, locations changed, but the method remained the same. He documented his crimes, shared the material online, and concealed his identity behind the now infamous swirling pattern. With every new discovery, investigators learned more about his movements, but almost nothing about the man himself. Without a face, they had no name. Without a name, they had no suspect. And without a suspect, one of the most disturbing international investigations of the 2000s appeared to have reached a dead end. As analysts catalogued every recovered image, they began searching for clues the offender hadn't intended to leave behind. Every object became potential evidence. The electrical sockets mounted on the walls, the style of furniture, curtains, floor tiles, plastic water bottles, brand names, calendars. Even the smallest details could reveal where a photograph had been taken. Some investigators spent hours examining a single image, zooming into the background in search of anything that might narrow the search. Most of the time, they found nothing. But investigations like these are rarely solved by one dramatic breakthrough. Instead, they're built from hundreds of tiny observations, each clue insignificant on its own. As months turned into years, law enforcement agencies from multiple countries started sharing information. His crimes crossed borders, so the investigation had to do the same. Eventually, the case reached INTERPOL. Normally, police began with a suspect, a name, a fingerprint, a passport, a face. This time they had none of those. Some investigators began asking an uncomfortable question. What if this man was never identified? What if he continued traveling from country to country, hidden behind a digital effect that no one knew how to undo? For a time, that possibility seemed very real. Then, he made his first real mistake. While examining online activity connected to the distribution of the material, investigators discovered a digital breadcrumb that hadn't been hidden behind a swirl. An Internet Protocol address, otherwise known as an IP address. An IP address is often described as a digital return address, a piece of information that can reveal where an internet connection has originated. When investigators traced it, they were surprised by what they found. The connection appeared to originate thousands of miles away in Vancouver, Canada. For the first time, investigators weren't just looking somewhere in Southeast Asia. They had a potential link to North America. But there was a problem. An IP address isn't a person, It doesn't come with a name and it doesn't provide a photograph. And on its own, it isn't enough to secure an arrest. It was simply another clue in an investigation that was already overflowing with unanswered questions. Authorities now believe that the unidentified offender wasn't a local resident of Southeast Asia. Instead, he appeared to be someone traveling there from abroad. As investigators reconstructed years of digital evidence, immigration records, and travel patterns, another disturbing picture began to emerge. His pattern of travel matched what experts described as child sex tourism, the practice of traveling internationally to exploit vulnerable children, often taking advantage of poverty, weak child protection systems, or the belief that operating across multiple jurisdictions would make detection less likely. Whether that was his intention from the beginning remains unknown. Every new jurisdiction meant different investigators, different laws, different records, different languages. If it wasn't obvious already, it was becoming even clearer that no single police force could solve the case alone. The investigation needed to become international. Interpol soon brought together investigators from multiple countries under a single operation. It was given the code name Operation Vico, named after one of the online aliases linked to the unidentified offender. Operation Vico became one of the most complex child exploitation investigations Interpol had ever coordinated. Detectives from Canada, Germany, Thailand, Cambodia, and several other countries began pooling intelligence. Every recovered image was re-examined, every digital file was analysed, every background detail was scrutinised. Teams searched immigration records, employment histories, internet accounts, financial information, travel movements, anything that could connect the unknown man to a real identity. By now, the investigation had become one of Interpol's highest priorities. Then someone did something that had been overlooked from the very beginning. The Swirl wasn't actually removing anything. This might sound obvious, but it changed everything. Think about the way a television censors a face. A black box covers it completely. A heavy blur blends neighbouring pixels together until the original details are destroyed. In both cases, the information underneath was effectively gone. Once those pixels have been replaced, there's no realistic way to recover the original image. But this wasn't a blur. It wasn't a black bar, it wasn't even a true censorship. Instead, the image had been warped. Imagine taking a perfectly clear photograph, placing your finger in the center and twisting the paper into a spiral. The face doesn't actually disappear. It simply changes position. Every pixel is still there, it's just been moved somewhere else. And if those pixels had been rearranged, surely they could be put back. It was an idea that sounded almost too simple. If the offender had used commercially available editing software to twist his face into a spiral, perhaps investigators could apply the same exact opposite transformation. Instead of twisting the image inward, they would twist it back out. The software used to create the distortion wasn't known. The exact settings weren't known either. Even a slight difference in the angle or intensity of the effect could leave the face hopelessly distorted. So investigators began experimenting. Again and again, hundreds of attempts, tiny adjustments, fraction by fraction, degree by degree. Each reversal produced a face that looked almost human, but not quite. Then after painstaking trial and error, something extraordinary happened. The distorted features began to align. For the first time in years, the man behind the Swirl was looking back at them. They could finally recognize him. Within moments, the investigation transformed. Someone, somewhere in the world, was bound to recognize it. For the first time since the investigation began, the man behind the Swirl was no longer anonymous. After years of staring at a distorted spiral, investigators were finally looking into a real human face. That discovery changed everything. Until now, there had always been one lingering question. Were investigators chasing a single offender, or could the same swirling effect have been used by multiple people? The reconstructed photographs answered that almost immediately. Every image matched the same individual, the same face, the same man. Years of evidence recovered from multiple countries suddenly came together. There was no longer an unknown collection of offenders. There was one. Now they just simply had to find him. The reconstructed image was circulated throughout international law enforcement channels and compared against most criminal databases around the world. Investigators hoped that someone had seen him before. Perhaps he had a prior conviction. Perhaps his fingerprints were already on file. Perhaps another police force had encountered him under a different investigation. Days passed. Then weeks. Nothing. No match, no criminal history that could identify him. Whoever this man was, he appeared to have slipped through the cracks. To investigators, this was both frustrating and deeply concerning. It suggested they were looking for a career criminal already known to police. They were looking for someone who had managed to live an outwardly ordinary life. With every traditional lead exhausted, Interpol considered an option it had never attempted before. Instead of asking police, they would ask the world. In October 2007, Interpol took the unprecedented step of releasing the reconstructed photographs publicly, urging media organisations across the globe to publish this man's face, asking anyone who recognised him to come forward. Television broadcasts, newspapers, websites. The image spread across the internet at a remarkable speed. With 24 hours, millions of people had seen the face that investigators had spent years trying to uncover. Tips began arriving immediately. Then something extraordinary happened. Several people entirely independent of one another all identified the same individual. They believed the man in the photos was a Canadian named Christopher Paul Neal. After years of searching for Mr. Swirl, investigators finally had a name. As they began digging into Neal's background, pieces of the puzzle started falling into place. He had grown up in the Vancouver area of British Columbia. Suddenly, one of the investigation's earliest clues, the internet connection tracked back to Vancouver, made far more sense. On its own, the IP address had never been enough to identify a suspect. But now, viewed alongside the new evidence, it became another piece of a much larger picture. Investigators also learned that Neal had spent years working overseas as a British teacher in several countries across East and Southeast Asia. The employment history aligned closely with the travel patterns investigators had already reconstructed from the digital evidence. It offered a plausible explanation for how he had been able to move between countries over a number of years while maintaining what appeared to be an ordinary professional life. Within days of learning his identity, the investigation shifted once again. This was no longer a search for an unknown face, it had become an international manhunt. But there was one problem. By the time investigators knew his name, Christopher Paul Neal had already disappeared. Just 11 days after Interpol released the reconstructed image, the international manhunt was over. Acting on multiple public tips from around the world, Thai police tracked Christopher Paul Neal to Nakhon, Thailand, where they arrested him without incident. For years he had hid behind a simple digital effect, convinced it would protect his identity forever. Instead, it became the very thing that led investigators and eventually the entire world to him. His arrest finally marked the end of one of Interpol's most remarkable investigations, but it wasn't the end of the legal process. In Thailand, Neal was prosecuted for the offences that authorities were able to prove under the Thai law. International investigations like these are often limited by jurisdiction, meaning prosecutors can only bring charges for crimes that fall within the authority of their courts and are supported by admissible evidence. As shocking as it was, his conviction was only 5.5 years. But many people, including myself, have questioned whether the punishment reflected the gravity of what investigators had uncovered. After completing his sentence in Thailand, Neal was returned to Canada, where he faced additional charges relating to offences committed overseas. He later pleaded guilty and received another prison sentence. Legally, the case had reached its conclusion. Morally, that's a very different question. When you consider the years this investigation took, the number of countries involved, the victims whose lives were forever changed, and the sheer scale of the international effort required to identify him, it's difficult not to feel that the final outcome leaves an uneasy impression. Justice isn't measured by whether someone is found guilty. For many people, it's measured by whether the punishment reflects the harm that was caused. In this case, I can't help but feel that many viewers will come away asking the same question I did. Was it really enough? The courts reached their decision, and the decision deserves to be reported accurately. But speaking personally, I struggle to see how the total amount of time served could ever truly account for the suffering inflicted on so many children and their families. No sentence can undo that harm. No prison term can erase what those victims experienced, and that's what makes this case so difficult to leave behind. Despite everything, the years of investigation, the groundbreaking forensic work, the unprecedented global appeal, and one of the largest public identification efforts in Interpol's history, the ending doesn't feel just. What is worth remembering isn't the man himself, but the investigation that exposed him. Operation Vico changed how international law enforcement approached online child exploitation investigations. It proved that digital evidence, forensic innovation, and cooperation between countries could succeed where traditional investigative methods had stalled. And if there's one legacy this case should leave behind, it's this. No matter how carefully someone tries to hide behind technology, every mistake leaves a trail, and sometimes the whole world helps finish the job. After serving his sentence in Thailand, Christopher Paul Neal was returned to Canada, where many believed he would finally face the full weight of the justice system. Canadian prosecutors brought additional charges relating to the offences committed overseas, and Neal ultimately pleaded guilty before receiving a further prison sentence. Legally, the courts had reached their decision, but for me, this is where the story becomes the hardest to understand. Millions of people saw his face after Interpol made the unprecedented decision to ask for public help, and after all of that, the total punishment many people expected never seemed to arrive. Neal received a 5.5-year Canadian sentence in addition to the time that he had already served in Thailand. In this case, I can't help feeling that the outcome left many people with more questions than closure. When crimes affect vulnerable children across international borders, many would expect the consequences to be equally significant. Instead, the final sentence remained one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case.